Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Well, Teodoro, should we expect you tomorrow, or will you only drop by next week? The loader's foreman handed several bills to a tall, well-built guy with dark blonde, slightly curly hair. Teodoro Alcalde, who preferred to be called simply Teodoro in his everyday life, gratefully took the money for his shift in unloading. "We'll see, Jecho," Teodoro replied with a smile. "If I don't finish with the wastepaper by this evening, then don't wait for me." The foreman nodded understandingly. "You're always trying to find work everywhere." "I respect that, Teodoro. I haven't seen in a long time hard-working guys like you. People usually come to us either out of great need or to earn money for alcohol." Teodoro sighed and simply replied, "Well, you could say I'm here out of great need. Understand, Jecho, everyone wants to eat well. And I've never been interested in alcohol." The men shook hands and went their separate ways. Teodoro was grateful to Jecho Morales for always being willing to take him on for a shift. They always needed loaders of goods at the station dock, and this provided Teodoro with a stable side job. Last month, Teodoro turned 25. He celebrated his birthday modestly. He bought a huge bag of his favorite sugar cookies at a cheap supermarket and distributed them to his neighbors in the basement, where he had been living for the past 2 years. By the will of fate, Teodoro had spent a significant part of his life on the streets, either wandering around the country or settling for a while in some quiet town where people were calmer and more tolerant towards wanderers than in the noisy and bustling metropolis. This time, luck was on his side. He quickly befriended a group of fellow homeless people. They were all remarkably intelligent and kind-hearted people, but circumstances in their lives had just taken an unfortunate turn. He settled in a large, spacious basement of an old multi-story building with them. There, he managed to create a reasonably comfortable living space for himself. Teodoro was not the kind of homeless person who drank alcohol out of despair or engaged in petty theft in stores and shops. He earned a modest but honest living by collecting bottles and various glassware, engaging in the packing and processing of cardboard at a recycling plant, or working as a loader at the station. It was a standard survival strategy for any homeless person who chose not to get involved in various criminal adventures, and Teodoro found this option quite satisfactory. He saw no reason to join any criminal groups, as the opportunity to earn a certain amount of money carried too many risks that a young man like him didn't need. On his way back from the station, Teodoro habitually stopped by a small, quiet park located in the center of the town. Here, he usually collected bottles left by local residents after their daytime strolls. Opening a large canvas bag, Teodoro systematically inspected the bins and peeked under neatly arranged benches in search of the coveted glass that could bring him a bit more money tomorrow morning. Teodoro was not at all bothered by the few passers-by who were walking in the park at this time. The young man grew up in an orphanage where he was constantly watched. Moreover, many of the locals already knew him well, so they were quite calm about his presence in the park. In reality, Teodoro didn't like to recall his childhood. He was treated extremely poorly in the orphanage, and teachers often lifted their hands against him and other kids simply because they never liked children. The adults themselves called such a parenting method realistic. Although Teodoro suspected that his carers were people who enjoyed tormenting those weaker than themselves. In any case, young Teodoro occasionally ran away from the orphanage to distract himself from constant beatings and reproaches. He would wander the streets, imagining what his life could be like if he had been lucky enough to be born into a normal, loving family. The last straw that made the boy leave the orphanage for good before completing it was a shocking incident that happened to him in his teenage years. Teodoro was 15 years old at the time, and during one of his unauthorized absences, he saved a tiny, very cute, and affectionate puppy from the hands of a horrible man. Some scoundrel had stopped on a bridge and was about to throw the little one, packed in a cardboard box, straight into the river. Only chance helped Teodoro, who was passing by, hear the pitiful whimpering coming from the box. The boy quickly realized that there was someone alive inside. "Hey, mister, what are you doing?" he asked the brute, who was about to toss the box with the puppy as far into the water as possible. "Not your business. Get out of here, kid, while I haven't harmed you," the man replied rudely, turning to Teodoro and baring his half-rotten teeth. But as soon as he did that, Teodoro felt a surge of pain and anger. Before him was not just some random guy, it was the director of their orphanage, Hilario Ray. The boy had long suspected that their director suffered from some mental disorders, but to act like this, openly committing such an atrocious act with the puppy in broad daylight, was beyond comprehension. And Teodoro could not allow such monstrous evil to happen. "Hilario, put the box on the ground, please," Teodoro calmly asked him. "Don't do this, don't destroy the puppy." "Teodoro, what are you doing here?" The director replied with a disgusting grin. "Aren't you supposed to be at the roll call right now?" The man was momentarily distracted to threaten the disobedient ward of the orphanage. "It's nothing, I'll tell everything to Pablo Borrego," Hilario threatened him. "He'll talk to you in such a way that you'll finally understand that running away from the orphanage is not the best idea." After hearing these words, Teodoro felt the still healing bruises twinge under his clothes after his last encounter with the physical education teacher and their disciplinary talk. Pablo liked to use various makeshift means in conversations with the students, and this time Teodoro had the misfortune of being beaten with the janitor's shovel. All the ribs of the young man were covered with abrasions and bruises, making it impossible for him to get out of bed properly for 2 weeks. However, according to the director and the entire teaching staff of the orphanage, such disciplinary actions noticeably increased the level of discipline and tranquility in the orphanage. Of course, many of the kids tried to report the teachers to the police, especially those who had recently entered the orphanage at a relatively conscious age. However, who would listen to children, especially teenagers from the orphanage? Moreover, Teodoro always believed that the local police officer had long been paid off by the orphanage director, so he deliberately turned a blind eye to the misconduct and cruelty taking place there. As for what happened to those children who attempted to reach out to other adults, Teodoro preferred not to think about it. He only knew that such attempts were punished in their orphanage in a very frightening way. All these memories and feelings merged into one huge, fiery lump in Teodoro's soul, which could only be gotten rid of in one single way. "Put the box on the ground, please," the teenager asked again, but more insistently this time. "And what if I don't?" Hilario sneered, then demonstratively reached out with the box, letting it literally dangle in his fingers over the silvery surface of the river. "You're a fool, Teodoro. No matter how much you're beaten, you can't seem to learn that pity and feelings in life are our main weaknesses and enemies. You've shown mercy to a stray, look at him. And you thought about what would happen to her when she grew up. She'll end up just like you, wandering the streets. At best, she'll die of hunger somewhere under a fence, and at worst, they'll catch her and do things to her that you couldn't even imagine in your worst nightmare." Hilario looked closely at the box with the puppy and said hoarsely, "I'm doing her a favor by showing mercy. It's better that I end her suffering now than if it gets 100 times worse for her later." "You have no right to decide who lives and who dies," Teodoro replied with a steely voice. "And you don't have the right to beat the kids either. So you'd better give me the puppy unless you want things to get worse for you. Are you going to make things worse for me?" Hilario suddenly laughed and shifted the box with the dog to his other hand. "Teodoro, I'll crush you into dust with my own hands if necessary, and no one will ever know. In this world, everyone doesn't care about people like you. One more wretch, one less, and no one will shed a tear for you." Teodoro decided that now was the most suitable moment to start acting. The guy swiftly lunged at the director and, with one agile, precise movement, kicked the man in the right shin. Hilario immediately howled in pain and involuntarily let go of the box. "Teodoro," the director yelled, "I'll make you pay for this when you return to the orphanage. I'll personally beat you so hard that you'll be lying in the infirmary with a smashed head for a month. You're an ungrateful scum. I feed and take care of you, and this is how you repay me." Teodoro didn't listen any further. He grabbed the box and ran as fast as he could. The teenager ran through the streets as fast as he could, eventually feeling his lungs gradually fill with liquid fire. There was no turning back. Teodoro knew very well that if he returned to the orphanage, he would simply be beaten. The director was right. No one would know about it, and no one would warn him. After all, he constantly ran away. And the cops, the boy thought to himself, won't investigate anything either. They'll close the case as an accident, and that's it. Reaching a safe place, a distant courtyard in the residential area of the city, Teodoro finally stopped. Gasping for air as if he were a fish thrown onto the shore, the boy breathed out with immense relief and sat down on an old bench, carefully placing the box beside him. Teodoro's fingers trembled as he used his nails to tear the tight tape, giving the poor animal a chance to breathe again. When he tore the tape, the boy opened the box carefully, holding his breath. From inside, black, shiny eyes and a sharp, fox-like muzzle were staring at him with fear. The puppy was a mix of dachshunds and some breeds resembling fashionable corgis, but it was very thin. Seeing Teodoro, the puppy whimpered again and tried to poke its head out. "Come here, little one," Teodoro said, pulling the dog out of the hated box. Examining the puppy closely, the boy noticed that it was a girl. Hugging the poor dog to his chest, Teodoro slowly stroked her, feeling she pressed her wet nose into his jacket while continuing to whimper. "Don't cry, everything will be fine with us now," Teodoro was trying to comfort her. "You are such a good, kind girl, no one will ever hurt you again, I promise." The puppy just sadly looked into the boy's eyes and then snuggled against him again with her muzzle. "I will call you Alma. Are you okay with that?" Teodoro asked the dog. "Alma means soul. I think you're really lucky today." Hearing her new name, Alma happily yelped and quickly wagged her strong tail. It seemed like she liked it. "That's great, Alma. We will now start a completely new life together, and no one will dare touch us, especially those scoundrels from the orphanage. Enough, I've had enough. If I can't stop them, I'll at least finally get out of this hell." Alma seemed to understand Teodoro's tone, and she growled softly. "Yes, my dear, I'm glad you're on my side," the boy responded softly, and he slowly walked along the street with the puppy in his arms. From that moment on, Teodoro and Alma became inseparable. Teodoro took care of his beloved for all these years, ensuring she had food and everything necessary for a dog. He always moved with her on his small journeys around the country. Wherever he went, Alma was always by his side. A couple of years after he saved her, Alma grew into a beautiful, short-statured dog that indeed strongly resembled a corgi, but with a completely chocolate color. People on the street would always smile when they saw Teodoro walking his beloved dog. Some even asked for permission to pet her. Teodoro never objected, and Alma rightfully received her share of affection and love from the citizens. Alma passed away a year ago. Teodoro buried her in a strip of wood outside the city and struggled for a long time to recover from such a heartbreaking loss. This dog had become his most loyal and devoted friend. For so many years, she had kept him warm during nights spent on the streets and had endured all the hardships associated with a homeless life. Yet she never ran away and never barked at her owner, considering him her favorite person on earth. Teodoro still missed Alma very much, the joyous barking, her ability to remain calm and kind in any situation. But the guy understood that the only thing he had no control over in this life was time. Teodoro took Alma to veterinarians, but they just shrugged, saying, "Well, nothing can be done, it's old." Nevertheless, Teodoro decided for himself that he would always remember Alma. He believed that she was now in some good place, keeping an eye on her homeless owner from there. After collecting glass bottles in the park, the young man headed back to his basement. There, his dormitory neighbors were awaiting him, and on this evening, they decided to cook some kind of fish soup in a small cast-iron pot. The unbearable aroma of canned fish, probably long past their expiration date, clearly indicated that it was a fish soup. Teodoro involuntarily wrinkled his nose at the bad smell, but managed to put on a friendly smile and wave a greeting to the other homeless people. Oh, Teodoro is back, exclaimed Valerio, once an engineer but now unemployed since the chaos of the 90s. We're making fish soup. It is almost ready, join us, he politely invited him. Thank you, Valerio. Teodoro thanked him and gave a respectful nod towards his concoction. I'm sure the taste of this soup will be absolutely amazing, but I've already eaten it today. Maybe next time, my friend. I understand, I don't want to overeat before bedtime, Valerio winked at him. You youngsters are always careful to keep fit, even when sitting at the bottom. In my opinion, if there's an opportunity to eat, you should take it. Valerio mumbled something good-naturedly to himself, and Teodoro took the opportunity to slip into his room. There, he once again sorted through the collected bottles, then carefully transferred the money earned today, unloading it into a special tin box. The young man planned to visit the local shopping center the next day to buy himself a new pair of sneakers. The ones he had been wearing for the past couple of years were practically falling apart, and Teodoro diligently set aside money from each of his earnings for a new pair he had already picked out in the store's sales section. Having done everything necessary, Teodoro settled comfortably in his improvised bed and instantly fell asleep. The day had been tough, so he could rest assured that insomnia wouldn't trouble him. Usually, after his shift at the station, Teodoro would fall asleep right at the moment his head touched the pillow. This time was no different. His sleep was deep and almost devoid of dreams, and Teodoro always appreciated it. He didn't particularly like dreaming, perhaps because in them he always lived some other, wonderful, and interesting life. While strolling through the shops in the shopping center, Teodoro enjoyed examining expensive gadgets and beautiful items. With a sigh, he looked at the latest model laptop and a trendy graphic tablet. Oh, if only I had such technology, I might have been able to somehow improve my life by now, engaging in design or drawing, Teodoro thought sadly to himself. Since childhood, he has noticed this inclination towards beauty in himself, but couldn't explain it. In some ways, he felt ashamed to admit this to his few friends from the orphanage, but Teodoro was a great artist. He thought his parents must have been true artists or, at the very least, people close to the arts. That's why he never judged his acquaintances in the basement and other homeless individuals. Among them were always those who were forced to accept the difficult circumstances of their lives, but that didn't mean they enjoyed vagabonding and collecting bottles from trash bins. Finally deciding to go and buy new footwear, Teodoro walked through a long, arched corridor leading to the adjacent wing of the complex. On the way, he came across a large playground where children of different ages were having a great time. Watching how joyfully the kids laughed and effortlessly leaped over the sizable inflatable ball, Teodoro couldn't help but smile. Oh, how much he would give to have the opportunity to play when he was a little boy, just like that, without fear, waiting for his beloved, kind parents to come for him and take him to the pizzeria, where he could indulge in delicious ice cream with them. Teodoro wiped away the tears that welled up in his eyes and, at that moment, noticed something strange. In the middle of the playground, there was a tall square ramp adorned with bright lamps that shimmered in various colors, creating a festive atmosphere around it. Teodoro knew that under this ramp, performances by entertainers were usually held. They organized whole shows to entertain the children while their parents were shopping. However, there were no adults nearby now, and the kids were left to their own, even though safety regulations dictated that someone should have always been present to monitor the functioning electrical device. Teodoro didn't like what he saw. Obeying some internal instinct, he approached closer and, at that moment, noticed that the lower part of the ramp was gradually beginning to emit smoke. Next to the structure, a little girl of about 6 or 7 was playing with a large plush bear, seemingly oblivious to what was happening behind her. Meanwhile, the ramp started smoking more and more. Teodoro suddenly caught the acrid scent of burning wires. "Hey, girl," Teodoro called out to the little one, "you should move away from here, it's not safe." The girl looked at him with confusion, shrugged, and continued playing as if nothing was wrong. Teodoro nervously looked around, trying to find the supervisor. However, no one was in sight. Hey, little one," he approached her again, "I'm not kidding, it's really dangerous. Look, there's smoke." and at that moment, the ramp suddenly hissed, as if an angered snake. The bulbs in it began to burst one after another, and the surrounding space was instantly showered with a hot wave of sparks and fire. Realizing that things were getting bad, without thinking twice, Teodoro rushed towards the little girl. Grabbing her, Teodoro only managed to cover her with his body as the entire blazing structure crashed down on them. The girl in his arms began crying loudly, but the young man held her even tighter. Teodoro didn't feel pain. He was as if in a vacuum through which distant cries and women's screams broke. A moment later, he realized that his back began to burn, as if with a red-hot poker. Managing to free himself from the fallen ramp, which still sparked and threatened to ignite again, Teodoro sprinted forward, not looking back, holding the little girl close to him. "Quickly, give her to me," a nearby high-pitched female voice said, and Teodoro handed the child in one breath. "Don't move, I've already called the fire department and an ambulance," the same girl assured him. After that, without warning, she sprayed Teodoro's back with a handheld fire extinguisher. The temperature contrast affected the young man too severely. He went into shock and lost consciousness within a second. The last thing he managed to see was the pale, tear-streaked face of the young girl, the playground attendant. She had a large bow adorned with sparkling rainbow sequins on her head, and black streaks of smudged mascara ran beneath her eyes from crying. "Oh God, I'm so sorry, she managed to whisper to Teodoro before his eyes plunged into darkness. Teodoro came to his senses in the hospital. He was lying in the intensive care unit, face down. As the doctor later explained to him, they had to perform a serious operation because he had very large and severe burns on his back. "You'll have to recover for a long time, I must say," the doctor warned him. "You're lucky that the nerve endings were not affected, otherwise, it could have been much worse." Fortunately, the girl from the shopping center did everything very correctly, skillfully extinguishing you. "The girl," Teodoro uttered in a weak voice. "There was a little girl. I handed her over to the attendant." "What about her? Was she harmed?" "The little girl is fine, don't worry," the surgeon reassured him. "You acted like a true hero. So now your task is to rest and recover. The girl has already been handed over to her father, so any complaints will be solely directed at the management of the shopping center and its electricians. Apparently, they overlooked some malfunction in the ramp, causing a contact failure inside and resulting in a short circuit." Teodoro could barely look at the doctor. "How did you find out all this?" he asked. "I have a friend, the chief of the fire brigade, who worked at the scene that day," the doctor smiled. "I'm telling you all this so you don't worry. No one will blame you for what happened." "And the attendant?" "She will likely face consequences," Teodoro spoke slowly. "She left the children alone." The surgeon shrugged questioningly. "I don't know about that, I won't lie. But I'm sure no one will praise her." The doctor stood up and added, "All right, Teodoro, I'll tell the nurse to give you another painkiller shot. Have some rest, and then you'll have a dressing waiting for you." Teodoro nodded, after which the surgeon left the room, leaving Teodoro alone with his thoughts. Well, the young man thought, the main thing is that the girl didn't get hurt. "I feel a bit sorry for the duty girl, of course, but it's her own fault. She quit her job in the middle of the day." A sharp, jerking pain between his shoulder blades interrupted his thoughts. The lingering anesthesia was making its presence felt. Yet something inside him told him that the girl didn't want anything like this to happen. For Teodoro, a long period of recovery began. Honestly, he hadn't thought he would have to endure so much pain and unpleasant procedures. However, being toughened within the shelter's walls, Teodoro managed to endure all the treatment and subsequent rehabilitation with dignity. Meanwhile, the investigator came to his room several times to clarify what exactly happened on that day in the shopping center. The middle-aged police officer questioned Teodoro in detail, after which he signed documents stating that he would be a witness in the negligence case against the electricians. The endless bandages, the itch from healing tissues, the nightly nightmares showing either the blazing shopping center or old caretakers all began to gradually fade away only after a month and a half. By this time, the attending doctor could finally bring good news to the young man. He was on the mend. "Well, just a couple more weeks here, and that's it," the surgeon said with a satisfied smile. "You'll be as good as new, except for a couple of scars on your back. But, sorry, that's the cost of production, so to speak." "Nonsense," Teodoro waved it off. "Doctor, you have no idea how much I want to get out of here. Don't get me wrong, I'm immensely grateful to you for everything, but—" "Oh, don't worry," the doctor calmly replied, "I understand. It is a hospital, no matter how well they feed you here. The main thing is that this time, when you ended up here, is the last. You're still very young, and I can see that life hasn't been kind to you. Pardon my saying. Where will you go after discharge?" Teodoro looked at the surgeon with a kind smile. It pleased him that this person turned out to be so compassionate and understanding, genuinely caring about him. "I have a place," Teodoro replied. "If my friends haven't given it to anyone else, I'll go back there. If it's already taken, well, I'll just have to find another place to spend the night." In response, the doctor shook his head sadly. "It's unfair that such a good guy like you has to sleep on the streets. Here," the surgeon pulled a business card from his lab coat pocket. "Try reaching out to this place if things get really bad. It's a new charity center they opened just 2 months ago. They help homeless people, feed them, provide a place to stay, and even offer opportunities for showering if there are available spots. They might also help you find a job. Occasionally, they have vacancies from social services and small private firms they collaborate with, looking for laborers. Take it, please, just in case you need it." Teodoro gratefully accepted the business card and shook the surgeon's hand. The young man was amazed that there were still people in the world who cared about others' misfortunes. 2 weeks after his discharge, Teodoro returned to his familiar basement. Fortunately, almost nothing had changed during his absence, and his trio of old vagabond acquaintances still lived there, watching over his belongings. "Teodoro, we thought we had lost you for good. Where have you been for so long?" Sergio, a 65-year-old man and former accountant who lost everything due to unscrupulous real estate agents, asked him. "I had a bit of trouble," Teodoro replied. Then he told his neighbors everything that had happened to him. In conclusion, he added emotionally, "Thank you for keeping my place and not throwing away any of my things. Come on, Teodoro. How could we do it? You're practically like family to us. We figured something had happened to you, but you don't have a phone, so we didn't know where to go or who to ask about you," Valerio exclaimed, embracing him. That was true. Teodoro didn't have a mobile phone simply because he didn't need one. However, after what had happened, he considered getting the simplest phone. "Yeah, it turned out unpleasant, I agree," Teodoro said apologetically. "But Valerio, I promise I'll solve this issue as soon as I can. We really need to stay in touch with each other, just in case." Valerio and Sergio nodded in agreement, and after that, the three of them decided to have coffee, which by that time had been brewed by their fourth acquaintance, Fernando. This homeless man was always silent, expressing his opinion only on special occasions. No one knew much about him except that he enjoyed fishing and had supposedly served in the police at some point. The latter, however, was always discussed in whispers and more as a rumor. No matter how much Teodoro tried to find out from them where they got this information, they couldn't explain it to him. "Hello, Teodoro," Fernando greeted him reservedly. "Glad to see you're okay." Teodoro nodded in response and settled more comfortably on an old straw mattress. As soon as the young man performed this simple action, he had a dull, throbbing pain in his back. Teodoro clenched his teeth, trying not to show his condition to the others, but his suddenly pale face gave him away. "Teodoro, are you okay?" Valerio asked anxiously and immediately brought a cup of coffee to his lips. "Here, drink, dear, it should help." Teodoro thanked his neighbor and took a sip of the hot beverage. To his surprise, it turned out to be really good coffee, with currant and raspberry leaves floating in it. I dried those leaves since last year, Fernando answered his unspoken question. Nature is better than any chemistry, whatever they say. That's for sure, Teodoro replied. The hospital warned me that my back would hurt for some time until the skin completely healed, but not like this. The young vagabond sighed heavily and shook his head. He had hoped that the healing process was about to end and that he wouldn't have to take those painkillers that had made his head spin so much. However, things turned out to be not so simple. I think I'll lie down in my place instead if you don't mind, Teodoro said, apologizing to his friends when he stood up. We'll catch up, okay? Friends, just next time. All right? The men nodded in unison, and Teodoro slowly headed to his compartment, where, after swallowing 2 tablets of the hated medicine with a gulp of water, he helplessly collapsed onto the hard mattress. That night, Teodoro couldn't sleep properly. Shadows kept playing tricks on him in the darkness, and cold sweat broke out on his forehead and neck. After tossing and turning for several hours, Teodoro finally gave up on trying to sleep. Instead, he sat on his bed as quietly as possible, took out the business card the surgeon had given him from his jacket, and thought, all right, I'll go there first thing tomorrow. Maybe they can help me. The next morning, Teodoro went straight to the charity center. He hoped to try finding work and perhaps make it in time for a free lunch in the cafeteria. As he approached the new, trendy, minimalist building, his heart raced in joyful anticipation of something good. At the entrance, a polite woman greeted him and, after clarifying his purpose, guided him to the local employment assistance service. However, luck turned away from Teodoro at this point. As it turned out, all vacancies in this district were currently closed. Try coming back in early September, the social services employee advised. By then, I believe we can find something suitable for you. Teodoro sighed but nodded understandingly, thanking the worker for her time. After that, the young man descended to the large cafeteria on the ground floor. Upon entering, Teodoro immediately caught the delightful aroma of freshly brewed chicken soup and savory vegetable stew. Joining the common queue, the young man grabbed a tray and utensils, patiently advancing behind another 20 hungry homeless people who had come to the center that morning. It took several minutes before Teodoro finally reached the serving window. Behind the counter were 2 people, volunteers, a young man and a girl. The guy was pouring soup for another homeless person, so Teodoro had no choice but to turn to the pretty girl in a gray cap, which concealed her long, wavy locks. Hello. May I have a portion of soup? It smells so delicious here, Teodoro said. Of course, the girl smiled and scooped up a large serving of hot golden broth. Take the second dish too, the chef prepared a lot today, sensing that there would be so many people. The girl handed Teodoro a plate, and at that moment, the young people locked eyes. In that instant, the girl turned pale, like the first snow, and almost dropped the ladle from her trembling fingers. Teodoro stared at her, unable to believe his eyes. You? Teodoro managed to utter. Oh! She exclaimed, hastily placing Teodoro's plate on the tray, nearly spilling its contents on the way. Excuse me, please. The girl turned abruptly to her partner and said in a lowered voice, Eugenio, can you cover for me for a minute? I'm not feeling well. With these words, she quickly removed her apron and, despite the discontented murmurs of other cafeteria visitors, slipped away from behind the counter. Wait, you misunderstood me, Teodoro called after her. However, the girl either didn't hear him or pretended not to. She continued to squeeze between glass food display cases before she completely disappeared into the kitchen. Young man, don't hold up the line, came a nasal voice behind Teodoro. Apologizing, he left the cafeteria and rushed outside after the server. No, Teodoro was sure he didn't imagine it. She was definitely the same attendant who left the children to fate on that fateful day in the shopping center. Teodoro immediately recognized those huge gray eyes, today devoid of any makeup. Moreover, in those eyes, he managed to read sincere feelings of guilt and fear. Circling around the charity center building, Teodoro saw her again. The girl was sitting on a small bench next to the black entrance, crying bitterly. What happened? Teodoro asked as he approached her. Are you really so upset because of me? I didn't mean to scare you. I'm sorry. The poor girl slowly removed her hand from her tear-streaked face and looked at Teodoro with indescribable bitterness. Oh, I'm so guilty before you. Forgive me if you can. I just thought you wanted to take revenge on me personally. My God, why? Teodoro asked with a slight smile. Well, you know, the girl sobbed, you suffered so much because of me. I thought you would end up disabled. I came to visit you in the hospital, but the doctor wouldn't let me in and said it was only for relatives. Wait, the guy didn't understand. Did I get it right? You came to the hospital to check on me? Teodoro was somewhat astonished. He never expected this young, fragile-looking girl in her early 20s to inquire about his condition after what happened in the shopping center. Don't think about it. I've already paid my dues, the girl justified herself. I was fired immediately that day, not even paid for the shift, and they slapped a huge fine on me, saying I was to blame for the cursed ramp catching fire. But I didn't do it on purpose. I was just going out to wash my hands. We were doing art with the kids, and I needed to rinse off the paint. I only went out for 5 minutes. Who knew it would turn into such a horror? The girl lowered her head onto her hands again and burst into bitter tears. Understand, I don't have any more money to help you, she said through her tears. I still have to pay them all with my salary. Teodoro felt incredibly sorry for this unfortunate girl, who seemed to be another hostage of the unfortunate incident, just like him. Sitting down next to her on the bench, Teodoro reached out his hand to her and kindly said, My name is Teodoro. And yours? The girl slowly raised a bewildered gaze at him, then cautiously shook his broad hand. I'm Marta Vincente. Nice to meet you, Teodoro replied with a smile. Marta, please don't worry so much. I'm not angry with you for that fire. Fortunately, we managed to save that little girl, and thank God, none of the other kids were harmed. Really? Marta asked, hopefully with reddened eyes. So, you don't want to demand huge compensation from me or curse me for generations? Teodoro chuckled softly and shook his head. No, that was definitely not in my plans. Of course, I was very angry with you at first. I thought you just forgot about the kids and trusted to you. But now I see you're telling the truth. It turns out what happened was just an ordinary accident. Marta weakly smiled at him through tears. Thank you for believing me. It's just a pity that the management of the shopping center and the playground don't see it that way. In a way, they're right. I shouldn't have left the play area, but the ramp has been faulty for a long time. Apparently, it couldn't handle another power surge, and, as usual, they blamed the least powerful employee, which is me. The girl sighed sadly and wiped her face with the sleeve of her work shirt. And do you work here every day now? Teodoro asked. I mean, as a volunteer? No, only twice a week, Marta replied. I sell tickets at the cinema, and I come here because I love helping people. Something like that. The girl shrugged shyly. In that moment, Teodoro suddenly felt a clear desire to see Marta again. Well, now that we've sorted everything out, would you allow me to come here during your shifts sometimes? Teodoro asked hopefully. Marta looked at him attentively and then nodded. And not only here. Come tomorrow evening to Northern Wind, that's the cinema where I work. We recently got some trendy action movies. I'll take you there, and you can watch them quietly. Teodoro literally glowed with happiness. The opportunity to see the girl he liked again and to go to the movies, where he hadn't been since he was 10 years old, this all evoked a surge of excitement in the young man's soul, and he warmly thanked Marta. Oh, come on, Marta replied with a laugh in gratitude. I'll be pleased too if I can somehow make up for my guilt. Teodoro looked at her and said seriously, You know, I've only just realized something really obvious. What? The girl asked with curiosity. If you hadn't put out the fire in the mall back then, I wouldn't be sitting here now. Marta's cheeks brightened, and she quickly lowered her shining gray eyes. I'm really sorry, Teodoro. It's time to go. I need to finish my shift. With these words, Marta lightly leaped off the bench and ran inside the charity center, leaving Teodoro alone with his thoughts and the first sprouts of warm and bright feelings of his first, real love. Another month passed. Teodoro lived as before, but now he had Marta in his life, and they began dating. It was essential and valuable for Teodoro that Marta didn't perceive his homelessness as something negative. She felt only sincere sympathy and tenderness for him. And although the young couple hadn't voiced it aloud yet, both understood that they felt genuine affection for each other. Marta understood that Teodoro needed to get back on his feet first, so she didn't rush him to confess his love. The girl herself came from a humble family, and she worked hard to pay the rent for a room in a dormitory where she lived. In short, the relationship between Teodoro and Marta developed in its own way, and between them, there was an idle and mutual understanding. The only thing that Teodoro found a bit unusual was that Marta didn't like talking about her parents. The young man honestly admitted to her that he had grown up in an orphanage in terrible conditions and had run away from there at the first opportunity. Marta sincerely sympathized with her beloved, but only said about her family that her mother and father never understood her. Therefore, she preferred to live with her own mind and moved from the village to the city. In response, Teodoro agreed, saying that sometimes it's difficult for the younger generation to find common ground with the elders, but nevertheless, he hoped that Marta could establish a good relationship with her family. To be honest, I don't really believe in that, Marta told him. My dad is such a stern and authoritative person that he'll never forgive me for renouncing him. He's very conservative, and the very thought of living differently than he dictates makes him sick. Teodoro then hugged the girl as tightly as he could and promised her, "You'll see, Marta. Everything will be fine for us. I'm ready to move mountains for you. I was promised a job at your volunteer center in the fall. I hope that will help me truly climb out of the social hole." "I believe you, Teodoro," Marta said softly, burying her nose in his jacket. "I believe and will support you in everything. I promise." Having given each other such peculiar vows, the young couple went to the nearest park, where they enjoyed the fading autumn sun for a long time before it got so cold that they had to head home. One day, while Teodoro was working on another shipment unloading at the station, Fernando unexpectedly came to him. Teodoro was quite surprised because the usually silent homeless man never showed interest in his work, let alone came to see him. "Hey, Fernando," Teodoro greeted him. "Is everything okay? Nothing happened at home?" "No," Fernando shook his head. "But I didn't come empty-handed. Take this." With these words, the wanderer pulled a small, folded sheet of paper from his pocket and handed it to Teodoro. "What's this?" Teodoro asked, surprised. "You should open it and read it to find out," Fernando grumbled slightly. "I don't have the bad habit of reading other people's letters." Teodoro looked puzzled at the man, but he still unfolded the note. It contained only a few sentences. "Dear Mr. Teodoro Alcalde, I invite you to visit the Blue Tower Business Center to receive a rightful reward for saving my daughter. I know it seems like a very belated offer, but I managed to find you only now. I hope you won't refuse to meet with me. Antonio Blanco, CEO of the White Sales Company." "Where did you get this note? Who gave it to you?" Teodoro asked Fernando. However, the man shook his head negatively. "I don't know who wrote it," he replied. "Some guy in all black approached me on the street, handed me this note, and asked me to pass it on to you. He even added a little extra money for speed." Fernando grinned cunningly and pointed to the piece of paper that Teodoro was holding in his hands, which he was clutching somewhat nervously. "Looks like serious people are interested in you if they're sending messengers. If I were you, I'd go there today. Maybe they'll really offer you something worthwhile." In response to this, Teodoro just shrugged. He suspected that the note was delivered by someone from the businessman whose daughter he had saved from the fire on the playground some time ago. However, he didn't need any reward. Any decent person would have done the same in his place. Nevertheless, a strange feeling arose in his heart that it might be worth going to this business center. It was akin to a premonition, which Teodoro had lately preferred not to ignore. After finishing work, the young man headed to the Blue Tower. The huge business skyscraper was located in the central and most prestigious part of the city, where luxurious goods filled the windows of expensive shops at every step, and people around were dressed exclusively in business suits. For a moment, Teodoro felt like he had entered a completely different world. His humble home was on the outskirts of the city, and he tried to avoid the central part as much as possible. He feared encounters with the police, and mingling among the rich public was not his style. Teodoro was well aware of his place in this ecosystem and tried not to cause problems for himself or others. However, deep down, Teodoro dreamed of getting even an inch closer to the level at which these well-dressed people lived, dining in fancy restaurants and driving equally fancy cars, simply because they had the opportunity. "Good day," he greeted the receptionist upon entering the business center building. "I'm here to see Antonio Blanco. I have an appointment for today." The girl, with perfectly straightened hair and the figure of a ballerina, skeptically surveyed Teodoro from head to toe, after which her thin eyebrows sharply raised. "Your last name, please," she said, ready to check her work tablet. "Teodoro Alcalde," Teodoro replied mechanically, thinking at the same time that everything that was happening was probably some mistake, and he would be kicked out of here any moment now. However, a minute later, the girl politely smiled at him. "All right, Antonio is already waiting for you. Go to the 24th floor, the guard will escort you to the right office." Teodoro thanked the secretary briefly and entered the doors of the dazzling and completely transparent glass elevator. When he reached the top, a personal guard met him and escorted him to the businessman's office. Approaching the doors, Teodoro felt a strange excitement, as if his entire life depended on the meeting with this prominent businessman. "All right, calm down," Teodoro told himself mentally. "You're getting so nervous for no reason, Teodoro. They told you back then, the girl was fine. Why would this rich man seek revenge on you now when so much time has passed?" Teodoro entered the spacious, luxuriously furnished office and silently stopped in the middle. Right in front of him was Antonio Blanco, one of the most influential businessmen in the region. He was a tall, athletic man in his 50s. He held a small cup of black coffee in his hands, patiently waiting for his unusual guest. "I'm glad you came to me today, Teodoro," the businessman said, turning around. "I've wanted to see the face of the person who saved my daughter's life for a long time." As soon as Antonio saw Teodoro, his hands trembled with a slight shake, and he almost spilled coffee on his business suit. His face turned as white as a sheet of office paper, and the man had to grab the back of his leather chair to stay on his feet. "Excuse me, are you okay?" Teodoro, not understanding anything, asked. "Maybe I should call an ambulance." "No, you don't have to do anything," the businessman slowly said and sat down. "It'll pass." After that, the man once again, now more attentively, scrutinized Teodoro. After a minute, he clutched his chest again and uttered, gritting his teeth in pain, "Perhaps you could help me, buddy. In the cupboard, on the top shelf, there are my pills. Please give them to me." Teodoro, without saying a word, rushed to the tall cabinet and quickly found the businessman's necessary medicine. Then he swiftly poured water into a tall glass and handed everything to Antonio. He first took the pills, and then, unexpectedly for Teodoro, he grabbed his right hand. "This can't be," he said, shaking his head and beginning to examine a small round mole right under Teodoro's thumb on his palm. "Maybe I should call the medics after all," Teodoro asked anxiously. "It seems like you're really unwell right now." Antonio raised his pale face to him and then quietly ordered, "Sit down, please." A moment later, he added, "I need to talk to you seriously." Judging by the businessman's stern tone, Teodoro expected the conversation to be far from pleasant. However, when Teodoro cautiously settled into the chair across, Antonio rose from his seat and securely locked the office door from the inside. "Tell me about yourself," the businessman began his career statement. "Who are you? Where did you grow up? Who are your parents? Why does it matter to you?" Teodoro asked a reasonable question, but Antonio only ambiguously raised his own eyebrows. "You see, I need to figure out one thing, but I won't be able to do it until I see the full picture of certain events. So please start." Encouragingly, the man patted Teodoro on the shoulder and then sat back in his executive chair, folded his hands, and prepared to listen attentively. Sighing, Teodoro told him everything about himself, about the orphanage, about Alma, and about how he now lived in the basement with other homeless people. Finishing his story, Teodoro regretted 100 times that he even thought of coming here. It was clear that something was wrong with this businessman's head. After hearing the boy, Antonio whispered in amazement, "Truly, your ways are inscrutable, Lord." After that, Antonio slowly turned his right palm so that Teodoro could see. Under the thumb of the businessman's right hand, there was exactly the same mole as Teodoro had. "Well, what a coincidence," Teodoro said embarrassedly, looking at the mole. The guy really didn't understand what this strange rich man wanted from him. "No, son, it's far from a coincidence," Antonio said, shaking his head. "I'll show you something now. Just promise me you won't try to run away from here or throw something out of line. Okay?" Teodoro felt uneasy. Only God knew what Antonio had in mind, but he couldn't just take off like that. "Fine," Teodoro nodded, "but you promise to let me go if I don't like what you're about to show." Instead of an answer, Antonio gave him a slightly perplexed look. Then he opened his laptop and mumbled to himself, "I recently decided to digitize the family photo archive, so it should be somewhere here. Wait a moment." The man was tense, searching for something on his computer, and then exclaimed loudly, "There they are, take a look, Teodoro." Antonio turned the laptop screen towards the young man, and he, looking at the several photographs that appeared there, was literally stunned with amazement. The thing was that his own spitting image looked back at him from old color photos, evidently taken in the late 80s or early 90s. A young man, strikingly similar to Teodoro, smiled pleasantly at the camera. Only the clothes were slightly different from Teodoro's, and the hairstyle made him distinct from the homeless guy. "Who is this?" Teodoro asked, stuttering. "He looks like me." Antonio only smiled condescendingly in response. "That's me, Teodoro. Do I not look alike?" The man gestured to himself, giving the young man time to compare. Only now did Teodoro notice that the businessman and the young man in the photos indeed had identical features, the same slightly curly brown hair and the same light green eyes. At the same time, it was also his and Teodoro's appearance. "How is that possible?" Teodoro asked in a hoarse voice. Antonio sighed heavily, and the smile on his face instantly faded. "You see, many years ago, when I was just starting my business, I learned how cruel business partners could be, especially if you refused to give them half of your business and capital." "So," Teodoro clarified, "someone betrayed you?" "My best friend," Antonio nodded, "and at the same time, my partner, my right hand, if you will." The man leaned back heavily in his chair and immersed himself in memories. "Lino Castro was with me as long as I can remember. We studied together in school, then in college, and later, we ventured into business together when we realized that the country was falling apart before our eyes. He was my assistant, skilled in negotiations, but at the same time, always seemed to be hiding something." Antonio sighed deeply and concluded bitterly, "It's a pity I realized it too late. When he came with his guys and offered to hand over half of my business to him, I was literally stunned. I even lost my voice. The thought that my best friend would want to strip me clean was so unacceptable to me." But Lino was serious. While Antonio was narrating his story, his hands slowly clenched into fists, guided by the pain of a past he could no longer change. "He took me to the woods and beat me to such an extent that, mentally, I had already bid farewell to my wife and son. I survived only by a miracle. Some mushroom picker stumbled upon me in the morning and, frightened, called an ambulance. Teodoro listened in astonishment to the man's story. He never expected to learn such things about him. However, one question tormented the young man. What connection did he himself have to Antonio's story? Teodoro soon got an answer to that as well. As I later found out, Lino wanted to do more than just destroy me. He wanted to take away the most precious thing from me, something for which I would unquestionably give not only all my money but also my life. Antonio stared intently at Teodoro and slowly said, "He succeeded, Teodoro. He took away my only son, demanding an enormous ransom and all my shares." Teodoro audibly sighed, sensing the tragic outcome of the story. "What did you do?" he cautiously asked. "The same thing any desperate person would do in my place. I turned to the police." "Oh, what a fatal mistake that was." With these words, Antonio slammed his fist loudly on the table, causing the papers lying on its surface to jump. I told him I had prepared the ransom and was ready to hand over all the documents. But when we arrived at the location, there was no one there. Lino called me and announced that I would never see my son again. He didn't specify what exactly he did to him, but implied that I had nothing left to hope for. Antonio wiped his face with a handkerchief, clearing the sweat that had appeared, and concluded his story. "I managed to save the business, but lost you forever, son," he said, addressing Teodoro. "I searched for you all over the country and even beyond its borders, but I could never find anything, as if someone cleverly severed all the threads leading to you." Only now did it start to dawn on Teodoro that Antonio had mistaken him for a lost son over 20 years ago. "I'm sorry, but that can't be," he said uncertainly. "If we were relatives, someone at the orphanage would have surely told me about it." "Why do you think so?" Antonio asked skeptically. "The goal of those people was to hide you as far away as possible, preferably in a way that you could never even imagine that you might be a businessman's son. Perhaps they placed you in such a horrible place, hoping you wouldn't be able to endure the monstrous conditions there." Antonio, sadly, shook his head. "It's a pity your mother didn't live to see this moment, Teodoro. She died almost immediately after learning that you would never come back home. Her heart couldn't bear such pain. Laura, my daughter, the girl you saved, is a child from my second wife, Christina. Laura is a wonderful girl. I will be grateful to you for the rest of my life for saving your stepsister." "What?" Teodoro couldn't believe his ears. "Are you trying to say that Laura and we're relatives?" On the paternal side, yes, Antonio nodded and showed Teodoro his birthmark. "You see, this birthmark is passed down in our family from father to son. It was on my grandfather, then on me, and now it has passed to you. There's no doubt, but if you allow, I would like to do a DNA test to finally dispel your doubts." Teodoro sat in front of the businessman, utterly bewildered. What a turn of events! He came seeking possible help, and in the end, he found his biological father. Was this all real, or just a wonderful dream? Teodoro had dreamed his whole life of getting off the streets, but he lacked knowledge, education, and simple human connections. Did he deserve such a twist of fate? "So, you mean there's a chance you're my father?" he cautiously asked the businessman. "I am more than certain that this chance is 100%, Antonio replied with a smile. "If you want, we can go to the laboratory today. Teodoro, understand, I'm not joking. I've been searching for you for so many years. You're my direct heir. I need to teach you everything I know so that you can smoothly take over this company in the future. Don't think you won't get a proper education. You can attend any university in the country you desire. Just don't leave now, I'm begging you." Antonio's gaze was filled with longing and an indescribable plea. Eventually, Teodoro slowly rose from his seat and, unable to contain the overwhelming emotions, tightly embraced Antonio. "Dad," Teodoro whispered, crying, "Daddy, I'm so glad you finally found me." A moment later, Teodoro felt Antonio hugging him tightly in return. "Teodoro, my son. Thank you, Lord, for giving me the chance to have a son again. Father and son held each other as if trying, through that one embrace, to make up for all the lost years. The DNA test confirmed the blood relationship. Teodoro was indeed Antonio's biological son. The happiness of loved ones is difficult to describe in words. Antonio decided to throw a big celebration on this occasion and promised to start processing new documents for his son as soon as he finished all his upcoming business meetings this month. Antonio wanted to give Teodoro his last name, get him a new passport, and officially involve him in the affairs of their shared family company. Additionally, the man hired an excellent private detective. He tasked him with finding all possible information about how Teodoro ended up in the orphanage. The results didn't take long to surface. Within a couple of weeks, the investigator provided Antonio with the initial findings. As suspected by the man, Teodoro was brought to the orphanage by Lino's associates, and they paid the director of the orphanage for his silence. Eager to bring justice, Antonio personally took on the case of that orphanage. Using his connections in the prosecutor's office, he ensured that the director and the entire teaching staff were either fired or sent to prison for their cruel treatment of children. The orphanage itself was disbanded, and the children were relocated to much more decent places, where, as promised to the businessman, they would be treated much better. In the meantime, Teodoro finally began to feel like a normal person. He left the basement, generously gifting his former neighbors with money, so they would long remember Teodoro as their greatest benefactor and friend. Teodoro soon embarked on his first phase of education. Antonio started taking him to the company almost every day, allowing the young man to gradually get used to what awaited him, transforming from a modest boy into a confident and knowledgeable businessman. Teodoro was delighted to become part of Antonio's family, especially since his stepmother Christina accepted her husband's long-lost son quite calmly. Little Laura, upon learning that she had an older brother who had saved her, practically idolized Teodoro. The girl often called her brother a hero and could spend hours playing with him, riding on his shoulders, and pretending to be a bird or a brave aviator. The only person who seemed upset upon learning about the changes in Teodoro's life was, surprisingly, Marta. Finding out that the father of her boyfriend was a well-known businessman in the city and the region, the girl not only did not rejoice but, on the contrary, became somewhat sad and distant. "Marta, explain to me what happened," Teodoro asked her, puzzled. "Between us, nothing has changed, right? Or are you worried that I might leave you now that I'm no longer a vagabond or poor? Believe me, I will love you always, and I couldn't care less about your social status." Marta affectionately kissed her beloved, but her eyes remained just as sad. "No, Teodoro, it's not about you at all," she was trying to explain, and each time she fell silent at this point. "And what is it then?" Teodoro persistently asked. "Tell me, what is the problem? Don't you love me anymore? Don't want to be with me? But why? Haven't I earned the right to know?" Marta only burst into tears, unable to contain her emotions. "Believe me, I would love to tell you everything," the girl sobbed, "but I can't. I can't." A strange tension settled between the young people after that conversation. Since then, they have seen each other less and less, and Teodoro realized that if he didn't take decisive action, he risked losing his beloved Marta forever. Convinced of the correctness of his actions, Teodoro bought the most beautiful diamond ring at a jewelry store for his future fiancée. He wanted to make the proposal exceptionally romantic, but to do that, he first needed to invite the girl on a date. However much Teodoro called that evening, Marta's phone remained unavailable all the time. He was worried. Did something happen to his beloved? Unexpectedly, Teodoro received a horrifying message on his phone. Inside was a photo of Marta, tied to a chair with a tear-streaked face. He pointed a gun at her head, and the caption beneath the photo read, "Come alone to the industrial zone. If you say a word to the cops or your old man, your babe won't live." The message included an address where Teodoro was supposed to go. He was ready to explode right there, but he understood that in this situation, he couldn't manage without his father's advice. Realizing the significant risk, Teodoro went to Antonio's office and told him everything. "Show me the photo," Antonio asked, and his son obediently opened the file on his phone. "How long have you been seeing this girl?" Antonio asked, astonished. "About 6 months. We met when I was still a simple homeless guy," Teodoro replied, looking bewildered at his father. "Did Marta tell you anything about her parents? Did she mention what they do?" Antonio asked cautiously. "No," Teodoro shook his head, "just that she ran away from home because she didn't want to submit to her father's will." Hearing the last words, Antonio began pacing the room with large strides. He couldn't believe that his son fell for such a simple trick. "Dad, just explain what's going on," Teodoro pleaded. "How are we going to save Marta?" Antonio stopped in front of his son and whispered, "I suspect that Lino is behind the kidnapping of your fiancée." "What?" Teodoro could barely utter. "Why do you think so?" "Now is not the time, I'll explain everything later. For now, we'll do the following." An hour later, Teodoro and his father were speeding along a country road, getting closer to an abandoned industrial zone filled with old, deserted warehouses and garages. As they reached the designated point, they received a call. A voice altered by a special program rudely informed them that Teodoro would be met shortly. However, as Teodoro stepped out of the SUV with his father, he never expected to be surrounded by a whole squad. "Couldn't manage without your daddy?" Lino sneered at Teodoro when he and Antonio were led inside the vast warehouse. "Bravo, bravo." The tall, bald man with massive shoulders and torso, resembling more a boxer from the top league, clapped his hands softly. "Where's my fiancée, you bastard?" Teodoro asked darkly. "What did you do to Marta?" Lino pretended not to understand him. "With Marta? Which Marta are you talking about?" He said mockingly. "You mean this girl?" In the next moment, one of Lino's guards rolled out an old office chair from a closed booth. Tightly taped and tied to the chair was a crying and whimpering Marta. "Lino, don't play games. Let the girl go," Antonio calmly tried to say. "She's innocent. Moreover..." "What? You still haven't told your idiot son anything?" Lino smirked and then turned to Teodoro. "And you, my boy, did quite a number on my daughter. She disregarded all the rules of our family. All my rules." As Lino said the last words, he snarled like a wolf, ready to attack. "What are you talking about?" Teodoro asked him again. His heart was literally breaking into pieces at the sight of the tortured Marta, torn between hatred for Lino and pity for his fiancée. "That poor girl is not Marta Vincente at all. It seems she introduced herself to you that way, right?" Lino sneered at him and then triumphantly continued, "This is my daughter, Nora Castro. My daughter, understand? And she was going to marry the son of my longtime enemy, you. What do you think? Could I allow such a mismatch, especially when Nora already had a perfect groom in mind, the son of the influential Roberto Santos? Marta, is he telling the truth?" Teodoro couldn't believe his ears. "Or is your real name Nora? Did you deliberately concoct this entire story with Laura to get close to my father through me? Were you lying to me all this time?" "No, it's not true," Lino interrupted him and slapped his tearful daughter across the face. "She knew nothing, of course. She just ran away from home when she found out she had to marry Arturo this winter. Silly girl even changed her name and worked, God knows where, just so I couldn't find her. My foolish one, did she really think I wouldn't find her?" Lino abruptly struck his daughter on the head with the butt of the gun. Marta, or rather Nora, screamed loudly and lost consciousness from the pain. "Don't you dare hurt her, scumbag!" Teodoro shouted and tried to rush to his fiancée, but a couple of hulks immediately blocked his path. "Let's get straight to business. Lino, what do you want?" Antonio asked, barely containing his anger. "Now that's a reasonable approach. We should have started like this," Lino murmured in satisfaction. Then he pointed the gun at his daughter's temple and said, "I want a full payment from you, Antonio, from you and from my son-in-law. Can't you calm down?" Antonio asked. "Let me guess. You want another part of my company along with the shares?" However, Lino just shook his head negatively. "No, Antonio, half is not enough now. Will you describe everything you have with your son?" "What if I refuse?" Antonio asked calmly. "You're right. But then I'll kill my careless daughter and your scoundrel son for filling her head with nonsense and making her believe she could have a life other than the one I chose for her. You won't dare to do that." Teodoro stepped forward. "Dad, I'm ready to sign whatever is required of me, just to keep Marta alive." Antonio looked carefully at his son and then nodded. "All right, son. I can't lose you again." "Excellent." Lino, happy in anticipation of the most advantageous deal in his life, extended. "And what about Marta? Will you let her go?" Lino asked Teodoro. "Of course," Teodoro lied. "What do I need her for? From now on, she's a traitor to us, me and my mother, and I won't let her cross the threshold of our home." At that moment, they heard strange sounds behind the warehouse wall. Lino took a fraction of a second to understand. It was police sirens. "You scum!" he shouted angrily, pointing his gun first at Teodoro, then at his father. "I'll crush both of you to pieces right now. I just don't know where to start." At that moment, the special forces burst into the warehouse, shouting, "Everyone, stay in their places. Everyone, lie down." A few minutes later, all the criminals were arrested, and Teodoro looked sadly at the girl. Medics were examining Marta. They were about to take her to the hospital. "Marta. Nora. I don't care anymore," Teodoro said, taking her hand. "I'll love you no matter what." "Teodoro, my love, I truly didn't think my father would find me," the girl weakly replied. "When I realized you could be harmed, I was so scared that I was ready to part with you just to keep you out of danger. If something happened to you, Teodoro, I wouldn't have survived it." Teodoro wanted to say something more to his beloved, but at that moment, the doctors asked him to leave Marta. They were planning to urgently take her to the hospital. "Don't worry, son, the doctors will take care of her," his father comforted him. "At first, I also thought that Marta, or rather Nora, knew everything. But then I realized that she didn't need to know. She's not like her mother and father, and capable of betraying her beloved." "I know, Dad," Teodoro replied wearily. "As long as she's okay, I don't care who her parents are. I'll marry her anyway. I love her, Dad." Antonio just smiled at his son and patted him on the shoulder. 2 weeks later, when Marta was discharged, she tearfully accepted Teodoro's proposal. The wedding took place by the seaside, and it was the most beautiful celebration among all the events attended by Antonio's guests at that time. Teodoro received an excellent education and became a successful businessman, eventually taking over the reins of his father's company. Throughout Teodoro's journey in life, his wife accompanied him unwaveringly. Marta completely disowned her father, who was sentenced to life in prison. By changing her name and surname, she definitively buried her past. Now Marta was raising 3 children born in a happy marriage with Teodoro, and Teodoro, every day, thanked God for giving him the opportunity to find his true family and the chance to embrace the closest and dearest people to whom the word betrayal was never known and never would be.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the